Hey fellas, drinking from my Mom and Ain't Easy cup today. Not my cup, but my flavored water inside is pretty good. Been plugging away at the privateer, and it's going well but slow, and I anticipated it going slow. And this build is probably, I would consider myself an average modeler, and this build is probably on the upper scale of my limits. And I wouldn't have taken it on if I didn't think I could do it. I've turned down a few builds that I think were just beyond my skill level. And so this is kind of stretching it for me. And it's not too bad. I mean, I think I can do it. I don't know what it's going to look like when in the end, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So be a good gauge of where my skill level's at right now. But anyway, I've never built a privateer. I've never built a B-24, so that kind of adds to it for me. Adds a difficulty level to it. You know, if it's an F4 Phantom, I've built, you know, probably 10 or so of those. So, yeah, you know, I kind of have a good idea what should be where. But with this, I've never built anything like it. So, it just adds a little bit extra for me. And you know, I know there are a lot of guys out there that are interested in this, and you know, from what I read online, a lot of people that like the privateer and the B-24, and you know, it's kind of amazing that they haven't come out with the model companies haven't come out with a privateer in 1/48th or 1/32nd scale yet. That's kind of weird. Anyway, another house cleaning thing. I had bought I recently purchased this birdcage Corsair, and I got to looking on eBay and found an eBay seller called Frankforthobbyshop, and I'll put his eBay ID up here. And I'd actually purchased it, and he had sold out of the plane, and he had just sold it in his store because he's got a brick and mortar. And he contacted me and said he'd be getting one in, and I ended up calling him. And a real nice guy, his name's Ed. And I got to talking to him, and he got me hooked up with that bird cage, and it's going to be for another client. But it's going to be a while till I get it built. And he didn't ask me to, you know, advertise for him or give him a shout out, but I thought I'd do it when I go to build it, but it's probably going to be a little bit before I start on that kit. So I just kind of wanted to give him a shout out, and he's a real nice guy. He's here in Illinois, a few hours north of me, I believe, but he's a real nice guy, good customer service. So, you know, if you're looking for some kits or some modeling stuff, be sure to check out his eBay store. And I will quit talking about stuff because this video is probably already running longer than what I normally do. So let's get on with the video. Now for the wings, I decided to tackle those next. And let's see what I got here. Okay, that's the one. So I've already started on the wing, and I've got this one cut off, and it fits right over here quite nicely. Is this the one? I think this is it. Yeah, I believe this is it right here. Let's see. Yeah, this is it. There's when the manufacturer molded this, you can see the 14L on this side. So that's matching up. Oh, I gotta sneeze. Excuse me. But there's a 14L right down here. So that kind of gave me a good idea where to cut this. And so what I've done is I cut the bottom and the top separate. And I'll show you how I do that in a minute. But it lines up pretty good. I had to do a little bit of sanding, and I may have to do some more on this male part, so it fits in there where I want it. But it looks like the join's going to be pretty good. and I will use 2-part epoxy to epoxy this, make sure I got it straight and where it needs to go, and I should be good to go on that. So what I'm doing for the second wing is I'm just taking this part and I'm lining it up, and that's going to give me where I need to cut. So I've drawn a line right here and a line on the other side. And I'm going to show you how I do this. And it looks like the part that the guy sent me had already been broken and somebody tried to fix it, which isn't going to be an issue because I got to sand all this off anyway. So how I'm doing this is I take a piece of Dymo tape and I'm going to put it right along the line, and you can use regular tape, but Dymo tape doesn't seem to bend. I did start off using regular Tamiya tape, but you're not going to get as straight a line as you will with Dymo tape. So what I do is I take my Tamiya scriber. Get this out of the way. And I'm just going to come along here and scribe that line. Okay. Now I can start pressing a little bit harder. There we go. It just snaps off. So you got a nice clean cut. And this is going to be the bottom portion. So this should fit up right along here. And I may have to do some filing and sanding, but that's going to be a pretty good fit right there. And I'll do the same with the top portion of the wing, and then I glue them together, and then I can try to fit them in there, and then I can file this off just to level it out and make sure it's all as level as it can be before I glue this down. All right, fellas, what I'm going to do now before I attach the ends of the wings onto the resin parts is I'm going to rescribe the panel lines. Now, there are a couple ways to do it. I found this works best for me. One, you can sand off all the raised lines first, and then mark out your lines and rescribe them using a template. And I'm of the opinion that's kind of a waste of time. Now, I've got a couple different scribers, and I've got this RB production scriber, and I'm not sure how wide this is, but it's my thinnest. It will make the thinnest line. It's my thinnest scriber. Then I've got this J-Tech plastic cutter, and it's a little bit wider. And then I've got the Tamiya scriber, which I think cuts out a little bit wider trench even yet. So what I'm going to do for these panel lines, and this is what I typically do in any scale, is I take my RB production scriber, and I'm going to use the raised panel line to guide my scriber. Now when I start out, and it just takes practice, is I hug it right up against the line, and you're going to make mistakes. You're going to go over and you know, go off the rails. Let's see if we can find, and sometimes I have to switch. Looks like I've got a little dimple there where it was going over, and I'm barely applying any pressure at all, and I'm just following that line. And then I just gradually increase the pressure. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a little trench for this little for the little tip on my scriber to run down. You can see every time I run it down, there's a little sliver that comes out. And I just kind of do it by feel. I think a lot of people, and I was guilty of this when I first started rescribing, is I would take this big thing and I would just start hogging material out, and that's not necessary. And in the end, you get these deep crevasses where you should have real nice thin straight panel lines. Take a look here. I think that's probably enough. And I'm just going to go along and I'm going to run this along the outside where I have intersecting panel lines. I'm going to run along the outside because if I come here, I'm going to hit this panel line, it's going to skip. So I'm just going to run along the outside where I've got a straight shot. And again, I'm just going slow. And it gets a little more complicated when you've got little squares and circles and all kinds of little things like we're going to have on the fuselage. But I figure you can get the idea with this simple wing extension here. Now for places where I'm going to need a bigger panel line, like right along here, where it's, I guess, the flap kind of like sticks out. There's a bigger flap on the bottom, a bigger panel line for the flap on the bottom. It's not just a panel line, it's a break where the actual flap can move up and down. What I'll do is I'll start off using one of these on the resin part and then go to with something bigger, and I can angle it and I can create a wider gap. Because it's more than just a panel line, it's actual separation of the parts. So I want to differentiate that from just a normal panel line. And I want to keep my scriber cleaned off from all those little shavings. Okay, now I'll come along here and I'm going to go on the outside. I'm not going to go on the inside. I'm going to go on the outside of this one. And I went off. Now what happens when you go off, like I did here, every time I go down, it's going to have a tendency to follow that. So what I'll do is I'll reverse it and try to get that trench in this way. It just takes patience and practice. And obviously, I am no expert. But I've screwed up enough stuff to know what works for me and what doesn't. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some sandpaper. I've got 400 grit, and I'm just going to lightly sand down the raised portion. Now you don't want to go too deep. If you can see right here where you'll know when you've sanded off the high spot of the raised panel line. We can take a look at this. You can see how the sandpaper hasn't touched that area right there. So basically you just that'll let you know when you've reached the point where you've sanded off that raised portion. And then you can come back and feel there's no raised spot. It doesn't take much. I'm not pressing hard. I'm just letting the sandpaper do the work. Okay, I'm going to check and make sure that I've got all the raised detail sanded away. Still need to do a little bit more up here. And that feels pretty good. Now I'm just going to take some isopropyl alcohol, kind of wipe away some of the dust, and then I can come back and just kind of, if I want to, I can come back with my scribing tool and just play with it and deepen it just a little bit, connect some of those spots where they meet up with the other panel lines, and then get some of that sanding dust out of there. And again, I'm not pressing hard. It doesn't take much pressure. I'm not gouging a big trench in there. I'm just putting a nice, even panel line in. It's not a panel line, that's a... Okay, now I can just put some more IPA on there, take a toothbrush, just clean it out. And there we go. It's not too bad. So I've replaced the raised panel lines with engraved panel lines. And, you know, once I get primer on it, I'll see if I'll be able to tell a lot easier if where I've made mistakes. So on the bottom, it's going to be a little bit harder because I've got all these squares. I may come back with a template and just make these squares with a template and my pointy tool. All right, I've got the cockpit all painted up, and you're not going to be able to see much of it, but I did add some seat belts and detailed up just a little bit. I may do a little bit more. From some of the pictures I've seen, there's some kind of a piece of equipment up here on top that you would be able to see through the glass. I may do that, but I got to check out some more reference pictures. But what I want to do now is attach the front to the cockpit portion of the plane. So what I've done is I took some pieces of plastic card and I just glued them to the inside part of the cockpit area in 3 different spots. I didn't do one down here. I don't think that's going to be necessary. And I went ahead and I rounded out, or I sanded some somewhat flat areas where the plastic card's going to sit. And this will fit in here just like so. And it's a little off. I'm going to have to do some filling, which isn't that big of a deal, to match it up. But it should fit on there pretty straight. And I'm going to use my Mark 1 eyeball. You know, I thought about trying to make a jig, but this fits on here actually pretty good. And I think I can get it straight just by positioning it. And it stays on there pretty well. And I'm going to glue this with 2-part epoxy. So I got my Bob Smith Industries 5-minute epoxy. And this is pretty strong stuff. I'm just going to put some here. I like this this Bob Smith stuff. It sets pretty quickly. Easy to work with. And one thing you can do with 2-part epoxy that I found, and I use this a lot on my, like when I make fire steels for my glue handles on my fire steels for my Kydex knife sheaths, I'll wet a rag with IPA, isopropyl alcohol. So if I get any excess on parts that I don't want the epoxy on, the alcohol will actually wipe it off, as long as it's the epoxy hasn't set up. You can actually, I found you can remove the epoxy with lacquer thinner, but obviously I want to get it off while it's wet, so I don't have to put lacquer thinner on here, because lacquer thinner will take away the or mess up the plastic. So I'm going to mix up my 2-part epoxy. It's storming here, guys. Okay, so how I normally do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the epoxy right along the inside of my resin piece. And I'm going to be somewhat liberal with it. And then I'll come along just along the edge, along the inside. But I'm going to come along with CA glue as well to fill in the gaps. So I've got my 2-part epoxy in here. And I'm just going to position it on here. Now this plastic card I used extra thin and I let it sit overnight. So I've got a nice strong bond from the plastic card to the styrene of the cockpit area. So I'm just going to put it on here and get it lined up with my Mark 1 eyeball as best I can. Grab my turret. And this might help me align it a little bit better. It's kind of hard to tell because I've got so many different colors. I've got the silver of the styrene, which I don't think is exactly perfect. And I've got the off-white and then the black, and it kind of distorts a little bit. So I'm just trying to make sure as best that I can that I've got it straight. It's kind of hard to tell, but with there being a lot of material on this resin part, I should be able to adjust and at least fool the eye if it's off just a little bit by sanding away and some material adding a little bit with filler. So, all right, I think that's about as good as I'm gonna get it, and I'm gonna set that there and let it dry. Okay, now that I've got my epoxy on, I'm gonna do the same thing with the wings. And oh, Jesus. Well, that sucked. So let's take my alcohol rag and wipe this epoxy off that I just made a mess of. And see how easy that comes off with the IPA. All right. Got that taken care of. Now I did have to, I guess this part had been broken by the previous owner or wherever he bought it from, and they glued it back together. So I took some sprue goo and filled in that area, so I am gonna have to sand that. But these have all been I've got the panel lines all engraved on the wings, and but I will have to do some sanding. But what I'm gonna do now is I've got these ready to go. And what I like to do is I like to put the epoxy on the inside of the part. And that way it just doesn't seem to squish out everywhere. Like if I put it on the male portion of the resin part, it'll squish out and get everywhere. Okay. Now I've got these fitted up. I kind of overshot the top portion of this wing, so it's not going to look like it's lined up real well on top. But I know where it goes. So I'm just going to put this on here. I'm going to get it where I want it, and then just put some tape to make sure it stays put. And I'd already done test fitting and made sure that it lined up where I wanted it. And again, I'm still gonna have to do some sanding and stuff, but it shouldn't be bad. And my daughter is on the piano. Okay, now that should look pretty good. And these fit on here really well. I'm really impressed with the fit of the wingtips. So now I'm going to set this aside. And we'll do the other wing. Okay, and that looks pretty good. Yeah, that fits up really well. I'm really impressed with this. So I will set this aside. I'm going to let my epoxy glue up or set up. And then once that's all set, then I can come back and I can start sanding and filling. And I am still going to have to clean up some of this wing, but you know, that just is what it is. I'm going to try to sand out these, see if I can sand out the little air bubbles that were left in here. Hopefully I can do that rather than fill them with a putty, but I may have to come back with a little bit of putty and fill that in. So